Warmly welcome to the Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program. This is the last session of 3 today, and we welcome you here. On the website, you can choose to follow a stream in Korean or to follow it in English. You can also put your questions on the Slido function on the website if you would like to. But first, before we start, starting, I would like to invite to the stage the Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, Jakob Hallgren.
Thank you, Dr. Hector Anders, my dear colleague. Great to see you all. We are now, as Dr. Hector said, starting the third symposia today under the Nobel Memorial Program 2020. This is an inaugural program. It is the first time we organize this at the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul with great partners. And now we are going to talk about literature and the award to Louise Gluck in this year of 2020. And the subtitle of this session is, How Can Literature Help Us Make Sense of the World? So I expect that we will hear from some eminent Korean and Swedish scholars and experts in the field about Louise Gluck and her works, but maybe also about the role of literature in society, what it signifies, and to what extent it can maybe be transformative or help us understand things that we normals might otherwise not put words on, and open new words. So this is intended to be an event for experts, but also for the normal, very curious human being like me and others. And I think this afternoon has really proven how incredibly interesting and important research and science can be. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed partners, both in Korea and in Sweden. You will hear from some of them soon. And really, without your support, this would not have been possible. Thank you so much for that. And also you in the audience, it's great. You've been with us, some of you, I'm sure, the whole afternoon, and some of you are maybe newcomers. It's so inspiring with the questions. Now, I hope you all feel comfortable and ready, because now let's open the Symposia of Literature. Thank you. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I also would like to invite to the stage a very important and valued partner to the embassy in conducting the Symposia on Literature, which is the LTI Korea, the Literature Translation Institute of Korea. I'm very happy to introduce to you the president of LTI Korea, Sa-in Kim, himself a published poet and literature critic, a professor of creative writing, and so much more, as a long-time active and respected figure of the Korean literary world. President Sa-in Kim, the most warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I am the president of Literature Translation Institute of Korea, Kim Sa-in. As you may well know, the Nobel Prize in Literature has been awarded since 1901 with anticipation of the future of science and yearnings for world peace as its two main axes. The prize for economics was later established. The efforts of the Swedish government supporting the spirit of the Nobel Prize for more than a century to this day have made it an honor that all the world looks forward to. And the Nobel Prize in Literature is particularly special. As a representative of the arts and humanities, not philosophy or general scholarship, but the product of modern civil society, namely the art of literature, is celebrated by the Nobel Prize. In other words, this makes it clear that works of literature are the most crucial embodiment of modern human psyche. Throughout the 20th century, modern world literature has been upheld, disseminated, and transformed by the Nobel Prize in Literature, without doubt. In that regard, the Nobel Prize is the institution that encapsulates with most clarity the values and aspirations of the modern era since the Renaissance. Uncertainties in our future outlook are yet again plaguing us today. Nevertheless, I hope today's program will start as serving as a platform to share insights on this year's laureate and also on ways to encourage more literary exchange between Korea and Sweden, and further to the role of literature and how the Nobel Literature Prize helps diversify literature in Korea, and further on to the future of literature for humankind and other worthy discussions as well. Lastly, I would like to extend my thanks to the many institutions and people who have made efforts to make this event possible, and also the audience from Sweden and Korea who are joining us despite the late hour on a weekday night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, President Kim. I would like next to address 5 of our valued partners, 4 universities in Sweden and 1 university here, Iowa Women's University, which is the venue where we are. These partners are tremendously important to us, as Ambassador Hallgren mentioned, for the international cooperation between Sweden and Korea. The ones that I will be introducing are the following. The president of Iowa Women's University, Hae-Suk Kim, and president of University of Gothenburg, Eva Wiberg, followed by the president of the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Sigbrit Karlsson, the vice chancellor of Lund University, Torbjörn von Schantz, and the president of Umeå University, Hans Adolfsson. Please enjoy these messages from them and listen carefully because they have very important messages for us.
On behalf of the Iowa community, I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely welcome everyone to this online conference, Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program. I would also like to convey our sincere appreciation to the Swedish Embassy in Korea for organizing this event. Korea has had a long-standing and bountiful relationship with Sweden since 1959. It is thus extremely meaningful that our 2 nations are collaborating on organizing an event for the first time in Korea to commemorate and celebrate the invaluable significance of the Nobel Prize. It's an honor for Iowa to be playing a pivotal role in this monumental event. Iowa has continuously interacted with the Swedish institutions in various ways. We have welcomed many Swedish students to our campus and sent our students to Sweden. Iowa also has had the pleasure of welcoming distinguished visitors such as Queen Sylvia and co-hosting the Swedish Film Festival every year to raise greater cultural awareness. I have no doubt in that through this event, Iowa will further contribute to strengthening bonds between 2 nations. EWA has many remarkable alumni in the field of literature who have enriched and inspired many readers around the world, such as Ms. Cho Nam-ju, best-selling author of Kim Ji-young, born 1982, a novel that was translated into 12 different languages and read by many around the world. Earlier this year, in March, an EWA graduate became Korea's first children's book author to win the Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, a prominent award established in 2002 by the Swedish government in the area of children's literature. We are currently living in an era that has never been more challenging for universities, especially in the field of literature, but EWA has remained committed to its mission, educating women to excel in the field. It is thus my hope that one day EWA will have the honor of proudly presenting one of our own graduates as a Nobel laureate in the field of literature. I hope you all enjoyed the symposium of this year's Nobel Prize for Literature. This year's recipient, Ms. Louisa Gulick, an American poet, is one of only 16 women to receive the award. From the vibrant panel discussion that will take place and from experts from both Korea and Sweden, I hope the audience would be able to gain greater insight into this year's award. Thank you.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Weiberg, and I'm the president of the University of Gothenburg. I'm honored and proud that my university is part of this excellent Nobel Memorial Program, and I wish that I could have been with you in person to take part of the presentations. Due to the pandemic, this is of course not possible. The pandemic has brought us many challenges. Perhaps the most important of all for the higher education community is for us to preserve and nurture global conversations, like this one between Sweden and South Korea. The University of Gothenburg is a broad and comprehensive university with a strong research focus. One of our strongest research areas is within political science and in public opinion, democracy and elections. In this field of political science, there is also an established research collaboration with Yonsei University. The collaboration is also strong within education, where the university has exchanged 200 students with Korean universities over the years. We are hoping that this is only the beginning of an intensified collaboration in education and research with the Korean higher education community. The Nobel Prizes are the greatest celebrations of science. In the year of 2000, the same year when Kim Dae-jung from South Korea was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Arvid Carlsson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Gothenburg, was one of 3 laureates in physiology medicine. A celebration of science, truth and facts, such as the Nobel Prizes, are of increased importance in challenging times when the international community must act jointly to fight a pandemic. It is with pleasure and pride I see the development of this joint collaboration between our 2 countries. I hope to meet you all in person in Korea during next year's Nobel Memorial Program.
KTH is happy to be partner in this event, and in times like this, it is even more important to keep connected. KTH is the oldest and largest technical university in Sweden with attractive education and world-leading research. KTH is an international university with some 30% of faculty having international background. Yearly, we have an inflow of about 1,000 international students. Korea is important to KTH for further exchange of students and more of excellent research collaborations. With KTH being an international leading engineering university, we'd like to deepen our collaboration as Korea is a world-leading nation in engineering and innovation. I see many similarities and mutual interests. I would like to see more Swedish students going to Korea to tap into the world leading education and research, but also to learn more about the Korean culture. In the coming years, I'd like to see more research collaborations and more of academia and industry collaborations. Being a part of this Nobel Memorial Program, I just have to take the possibility to tell you about the real pride for KTH, Hannes Alfvén. He is our first but not last Nobel laureate. Professor Alfvén got the Nobel Physics Prize in 1970, and he is considered a pioneer in the field of plasma physics, and his discoveries play a crucial role in today's space research. I have visited Korea a couple of times, and it's a fascinating country. Already in 2013, I joined a delegation of Swedish rectors who visited a large number of excellent universities in the Seoul area. I have really enjoyed my stays. I was impressed by the high quality of the universities and the amazing labs for experimental research. I look forward to once again come back to Korea in real life. For us at KTH, this event is an opportunity to further engage KTH in deeper discussions to increase the ties with your wonderful country.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Lund University, it is an honor to welcome you today to this Nobel Memorial Symposia. As two of the world's most innovative countries, Sweden and South Korea have a great deal to learn from each other and many reasons to cooperate. Learn and cooperate on emerging technologies, digitalization and AI, and sustainability issues, to name just a few areas. South Korea inspires us in many ways. One example is the large investment in electric roads that Sweden is now making, such as the Evolution Road project here in Lund. This was all inspired by the work KAIST has done with inductive electric roads, the so-called OLEV project. So collaboration with South Korea is important to Lund University. Last year, we decided on an action plan for collaboration with Asia, and South Korea occupies a prominent place in this work. Here in Lund, we host two of the most advanced research infrastructure projects in Northern Europe, MAX4 and the European Spallation Source. Such facilities provide a strong foundation for furthering research cooperation with South Korea. It is my hope that the Nobel Memorial Symposia will stimulate increased scientific ties between our countries and between individual researchers. I am glad that you are joining us for this event, and I wish you all success.
Dear friends of Korea and Sweden, greetings from Umeå and Umeå University. My name is Hans Adolfsson and I'm the Vice Chancellor at Umeå University. And as the university, we are very happy to be part of the Swedish-Korean Nobel Memorial Program today. Umeå University has been collaborating with the Swedish Embassy in Seoul since 2013. We currently have 7 partner universities in Korea and would like to establish additional partnerships and to extend the relationships regarding research collaborations. Umeå University's strong research areas include, for example, global health, infection biology, plant and forest biotechnology, aging and population studies, and research connected to the Arctic regions. My personal professional background is within chemistry, and therefore I am especially proud that the groundbreaking discovery, which is awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry, began at a laboratory here at Umeå University. The CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors, one of the gene technology's sharpest tools, was discovered by Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna. At the time of the discovery, Emmanuelle Charpentier was a group leader here at MIMS, the Laboratory of Molecular Infection Medicine Sweden, at our university. In fact, over there. She often mentions Umeå as a place where she really could focus on her research, and that it was a great platform for networking and sharing ideas. I personally had the opportunity to visit Seoul in 2014, and it was a great experience. Therefore, I also look forward visiting Korea again, and hopefully next year's Nobel Memorial Program can take place in Seoul. So, with that, enjoy today's meeting and do take care. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these welcoming words from our valued partners, and we know that they would prefer to be here live, but that will have to wait until next year. I'm very happy now to introduce to you Annelies Brännström Öhman. She is professor in literary studies and gender studies at Umeå University, which was the latest speaker as well. Professor Brännström Öhman is the author of several books, essays, and articles. Her research has primarily been on love in the Swedish 20th century novels, feminist theory, and creative academic writing. Please give a very warm welcome to you, Professor Annelies Brännström Öhman.
Thank you very much. So I will share some thoughts on this year's Nobel laureate, Louise Glück, in literature. She has been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature 2020 for her, and I quote, unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal, unquote. But first of all, I want to give my thanks to the organizing committee of this Nobel laureate event, quite unique in its ambition to open up a time space for the exchange of reading experiences and poetical challenges in the works of this year's Nobel Prize winner in literature, the American poet Louise Glück. In itself, this is an event of pure luxury for all of us who read, write, research or translate poetry, because poetry is, despite praise of critics and its status in the history of literature, the seldom read genre, the genre of shared loneliness, the writers and the readers alike, working just as much with slowness and silences as carefully selected words and emotions. Or, to quote the I'm sorry, I cannot change my slides here. I have to pause a little.
We are looking here.
Wrong. Oh, here.
There.
Okay, now I understand. To quote the Danish poet Pia Tafstrup, poetry is a wondrously quiet work, considering the fact that language is the material and the body its instrument, unquote. However, these aspects of silence and slowness must not be confused with lack of relevance in poetic matter. On the contrary, these are the means of which poetry makes its often discreet but lasting imprints on the surface of history as well as contemporary life. In my view, this is even more important to underline in regard to female poets. Louise Glück is no exception. In different variations, her poetry has been read and labeled as a form of, as I would call it, existential gardening and domestic small talk, often in all well-meaning in reference to her recurring themes of seasonal reflections on light and darkness, growth and withering in nature, as well as emotional cycles of family life in patterns of intimacy, rejection, sorrow and loss, especially those of mother-daughter, as well as sister-sibling relationships. In my talk, I will both comment on and challenge this implicit gendering of Louise Glück's poetry and try to show with some brief examples how it affects our understanding of the scope of her work. In the end, I will present my reading departing from a critical feminist perspective listening to a more seldom observed tone of low, intense anger and passion in Louise Glick's, with the words of the Nobel Prize motivation, unmistakable poetic voice. But before I go further into the motivation, I just want to give you a brief presentation of Louise Glick's life and works. Glick was born in 1943 in the middle of World War II in New York City and grew up in Long Island as the elder of two sisters. A third sister has died before she was born. Her parents were both European Jews of Russian and Hungarian descent, but their families had emigrated to America some generation ago. The ambivalence of how this ancestry affected her childhood and yet not is described in the poem Memoir, in which the bare naming of the shadow of the Holocaust is enough to make us see its presence in contrast to the prosperous American life on Long Island, New York. I quote, "I was born cautious under the sign of Taurus. I grew up on an island, prosperous, in the second half of the 20th century. The shadow of the Holocaust hardly touched us," unquote. Louise Glick's family had a small business, the daily life divided in the gender-specific order typical for the time, with a working dad and a housewife mother. This gave a somewhat contradictory impression when they encouraged their daughters to get a good education, an ambivalence which is portrayed in many of Glick's poems, on the tension between mothers and daughters in the idyllic setting of suburban middle-class life, where most grown women seem to be constantly pregnant and involved in discussing recipes for summer barbecues, Thanksgiving dinners, or the knitting of red Christmas sweaters. However, both the Glick sisters went to the prestigious Ivy League colleges and both turned out to be writers, but in different genres. The younger sister, Therese, conducted a career as a bank manager while writing short fiction. Louise, who had started writing poetry in her early childhood, published her first poems in the ladies' journal Mademoiselle in her early 20s, which, in brackets, may be noted as a striking similarity with the early writing career of Sylvia Plath, documented in her cult novel The Bell Jar, an influence that Glick herself also has mentioned. Glick's first collection of poetry, Firstborn, was published in 1968, seemingly more affected by her own life circumstances than the ongoing student revolts and political movements. But in a more low-key tone, the motives and conflicts she embedded in her poems had a distinct connection to some of the most urgent issues of the feminist movement, most obvious in regard to body politics and anxiety as suppressive powers in a young woman's life. In her teens, Louise had developed a severe case of anorexia, which took her more than 10 years to get through, including 7 years of psychoanalytic therapy. All of this gave resonance in themes and recurring thought patterns in her following books, not the least in her original interpretation of figures from Greek mythology, such as a triangle drama between mother, daughter, and death, in the myth of Persephone and Demeter, which in its turn is associated on multiple connecting levels with her many poems on the transitions between seasons, darkness, and light. As well as, I want to add, in transferred meaning, a deeply conflict-ridden relation to the growth of the own body in a repetitive cycle of eating and starving, budding life and frozen life. In many critical and scholarly readings, Glick's method of drawing on her own lived experiences has been understood as an autobiographical or even confessional driving force in her writing. Personally, I disagree with this perspective. For me, it is more obvious that she enacts and reenacts scenes from different phases of life through impersonating the girl she once was side by side with the mind of her mother, as well as the mythical figures like Persephone and Achilles, relativizing both gender, age, and time as a fluid space. Today, Louise Glück is 77 years old and holds a position as one of the most award-winning and loved poets in contemporary American poetry, with a body of work consisting of 12 collections of poetry and a couple of essay books. Her latest published book is Faithful and Virtuous Night from 2014, where she once again goes back into the nights and eerie fairy tales of childhood. Before the Nobel Prize, she has, just to mention a few, been rewarded with the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, the National Humanities Medal, as well as earlier this year, the award in honor of the Swedish Nobel laureate and poet Thomas Tranströmer. She currently lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is a professor and writer in residence at Yale University. When she receives the Nobel Prize on the 10th of December, she will be the 16th woman out of a total of 117 Nobel laureates in literature, a fact that is remarkable in itself, and which I leave you to ponder on, since the time frame for my talk doesn't allow excursions. So, against this backdrop, it is high time for me to go back to the Nobel Prize and the motivation, which actually serves as an excellent starting point for the rest of my talk. And I quote again, "For her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal," unquote. This is indeed an interesting motivation in many ways. On one hand, it may be considered as a typical Nobel Prize motivation, when the winner is a poet, that is, with terms of literary value derived from classic notions of originality, beauty, and universal relevance, often seen in connection to ostensibly timeless literary themes like love, death, grief, and aging. When these values are connected with a female writer, they may also be seen as an even higher degree of recognition, since universal qualities almost always are associated with the most representative human experience, which even today is considered to be more or less synonymous with male experience. But that is a fact that makes it rather double-edged, taken as a compliment for a female poet. And on the other hand, these are indeed also notions of literary value that for many more reasons than gender politics can and preferably ought to be contested. Stating a universal relevance for a poet's work is also, at least partly, to take an implicit but seldom mentioned Western perspective for granted as the foremost source of existential experiences, which is something that Louise Glück herself recognized in her very first and astonished reaction on receiving the Nobel Prize, in an interview with New York Times, saying she was, and I quote, "completely flabbergasted that they would choose a white American lyric poet. It does not make sense," unquote. The other part of the motivation, her unmistakable poetic voice, carries a bit of the same ambiguous quality. Again, according to Glück herself, this uniqueness of voice often imposed on her poetry might as well function as a curse, an unwanted return to the same topics, and implicitly an inability to vocalize other lyrical tones. With this said, and held as a backdrop, it is also, of course, important to see the genre of prize and award motivations for what it is, a highly condensed summary with no pretension to cover the whole picture. So, for the remaining minutes of my talk, I want to take the opportunity to make a quick dive into Louise Glück's poetic whereabouts and surroundings, trying to trace her specific branch of existential gardening and domestic small talk, as I slightly pejorative addressed it in my introduction. I did so just to underline the risk of just by habitual thinking, connecting female poetry to an underlying conception of the small world, defined by picket fences, perfectly tended rose gardens, and laundry drying in the wind. In other words, the prejudiced understanding of the limited worldview of housewives, such as Glick's own mother. But all these aspects of the gardening theme have indeed a prevalence throughout the years in Glick's poetry, and has accordingly quite often been mistaken as a wish for seclusion, not the least with parallels pointed out to her precursor, Emily Dickinson, famous or perhaps infamous for spending most of her life in her father's house and seldom leaving the premises except from walks and flower gazing in the garden, always dressed in white. This frequently reproduced narrative about Emily Dickinson's timid life is, thus, projected on Louise Glick by mere thematic association, not taking into account that it was already in relation to Dickinson a rather problematic misconception applied on a poet who had the odd and subversive habits of rowing in the wild nights of Eden in her own backyard and keeping Vesuvius at home. I would say that the same thing goes for Louise Glick's poetic world. There is a haunted presence in many of her books, the ghost of a girl in a middle-aged woman's body, once dead but saved to life just by getting away from being caught, a Saint John on the verge of being martyrized, or an unrecognized child Lazarus waiting to be revived. And I quote, "I was Lazarus, the world given to me again. Nights I lay in my bed, waiting to be found out, and the voices returned, but the world refused to withdraw." Unquote. This reluctant participation in the world and its turmoil of affairs indeed marks a striking resemblance to Emily Dickinson's poetry. But in its many visual and sensual details, it also makes me think of the surrealist paintings of, for instance, Leonard Carrington. It is an atmosphere which constantly reminds the reader that while reading Glick, that he or she is entering a zone of experience, whether located in the nursery or the garden, where, to quote one critic, all words are, quote, landmines waiting to be stepped on, unquote, noting in the same breath that Glick's poems has a strange way of seeming posthumous. It is, as in the line I borrowed for the title of my talk, a crime that has been committed against a human soul. A sense that a low, intense danger or anger is omnipresent and sooner or later will explode or act with violent means upon one or another of us, such as in the poem Study of My Sister in the Seven Ages, which the line comes from. The two sisters are reading and playing with no specific purpose when suddenly one of them feels the risk of slipping and falling in her mind and through time. I think this presence of danger transforming to self-protective anger is in its turn an impression created by the strange fluid tense of time which I mentioned earlier, which occurs in many of Glick's poems. Nothing is completely past, and the present is never to be relied on to carry the weight of daily life. This may be illustrated both in the flowing limits between the lives of garden flowers and gardener in the book The Wild Iris, where the almost eco-critical, blurred coexistence of mind and matter in plant and human body alike is arranged in liturgical patterns, celebrating matins and vespers in an ongoing dialogue. And even more so, in the repeated and reversed transitions from light to darkness, in the transition between day and night, summer and winter, and not the least, the being of the fetus in the mother's womb, where the fragments of memories of dwelling in, I quote, cells of great darkness, unquote, is mirrored in the presence of darkness in the very midst of summer solstice, concluding the existential situation we all share, whether universal or not. And isn't this exactly where we stand now, in every meaning of the word, at least in the northern hemisphere, in early December 2020, this forlorn pandemic year? And Louise Glick was and is wise enough to anticipate the need to remind us that we've been here before. And I quote, shortness of the days, darkness, coldness of winter, it is in our blood and bones. It is in our history. It takes genius to forget these things, unquote. And that was the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Brännström Öhman, for your learned lecture, so much more than just an intervention. I have several questions for you, and please hang on so we can come back to discuss them in a while. First, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Sung-ho Yo. He is a professor at the Department of Korean Literature and Language at Hanyang University. Professor Yo is also recognized and awarded literary critic and the president of the Korean Poetic Studies Association. Most recently, he is the recipient of the Daesan Literary Prize for critic. You are most welcome, Professor Sung-ho Yo.
Good evening. Good morning. I teach Korean language and literature at Hanyang University, and my name is Yu Sung-ho. So at the Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program, it is a great honor to be speaking about the Nobel Prize in Literature and also Korean literature. I would like to extend my thanks to the Swedish Embassy in Seoul and the Literature Translation Institute of Korea, His Excellency the Ambassador, and also the President of LTI Korea. I would like to extend my thanks to them as well. So Professor Uman provided a very in-depth introduction and analysis of the work of this year's laureate, Louise Glick. I would like to skip the parts that coincide with her talk, and I would like to explore more about Korean literature. So the Nobel Prize in Literature is the most well-known, universally known prize in literature. And I did some research. The history of the Nobel Prize in Literature began in 1901. In the very early 20th century, and it has had 117 laureates to this date. It is awarded to an author who has contributed to mankind in the field of literature, and it is not awarded to a particular work, but to an author and the entire body of work from that author. And I will not go into the details about how the candidates are nominated. So this is a history of the Nobel Prize in Literature. The first prize was awarded to the poet Sully Prudhomme in 1901. And we see that this year's laureate is also a poet. So I note that the Nobel Prize in Literature began with poems, and then the last recipient is also a poet. Because of many reasons, because of war, because of many reasons, sometimes some authors would refuse to take or accept the award. And in some occasions, 2 laureates were awarded in the same year. So we see on the presentation slide, we see some laureates who had refused to accept the award, and also 2 authors who were announced as laureates in the same year. And the Nobel Prize in Literature is an award that celebrates an author, not one particular work. And it's not only for works of literature, writers of works of literature, but it also is awarded to philosophers like Henri Bergson and historians like Theodore Mommsen. And also, Jean-Paul Sartre is also well known for his fiction, Nausea, but he is better known as a philosopher of existentialism. But the most widely known winner of this prize would be the 2016 winner, American pop singer Bob Dylan. Dylan has brought themes such as anti-war and human rights into his lyrics, and the other themes he explores in his lyrics are appreciated for their literary significance as well. His most famous song is Blowing in the Wind, and you just saw a photo of Bob Dylan. Now to Korean literature and the Nobel Prize in Literature. Korea has not yet won any prizes from the Nobel Committee. While our neighboring countries, Japan and China, have had laureates. But nominations from South Korea have been made. In 1982, Kim Dong-ri was nominated, and Hwang Sun-won, Park Kyung-hee, Hwang So-kyung, Kim Ji-ha, Lee Mun-yeol, and Shin Kyung-suk have been named as strong contenders. So some people say that Korean literature is too obsessed with winning the Nobel Prize. And other people say that the Nobel Prize in Literature is most important because it obtains universality for the value of work of Korean literature. So that was my introduction. And what I wanted to share with you today was that here we are having this event at the cradle of women's education in Korea, Ewha Women's University, and this year's laureate is a Caucasian woman. So I would like to speak about the Nobel Prize in Literature in terms of women and poetry. Of the 117 laureates, only 16 are women, including Louis Gluck of this year. So that amounts to around 14% of the total laureates. So we can say that it's an award that is very unfavorable towards women. The first woman to win the prize was Lagerlof, and then 17 years would pass before another woman, Grazia Deledda, would win. And only 6 female laureates won the award before the 1990s. So in 2007, we had Doris Lessing from the UK, and in 2009, from Germany, we had Herta Müller. And in 2015, the Belarusian investigative journalist Svetlana Alexievich won the award. And in 2018, the laureate was Olga Tokarczuk. And the 16th woman laureate of this award is this year's Louise Gluck. In particular, the writings of Svetlana Alexeyevich are works of nonfiction. So up to that point, the winners were mostly writers of a fiction or poetry. However, reportage or investigative journalism was included as a genre that was eligible for the Nobel Prize in Literature, thanks to 2015 when Svetlana Alexeyevich won the award. And this year, Louise Glück was awarded for her voice with austere beauty that makes individual existence universal. And that underlines the universality of the beauty of lyrical poetry. So the many issues in the world, like conflicts, racism, gender issues, divided countries like on the Korean Peninsula, war. Unlike those issues, the grief of death or other existential themes, or giving a voice to a flower. The world of poetry of Louise Glück is about lyric poetry, and it is the most profound, most highbrow poetry that can be thought of. And her first collection of poems that she published when she was 25 voiced depression, isolation, pain, and discontent with stirring imagery. And her writing style that makes use of traditional rhyme and rhythm, and also a conversational approach, is very well appreciated. So she became very firmly established as a lyric poet, and she also won the Pulitzer Prize. Louise Glück said, as she was accepting as she was notified of winning the Nobel Prize, that she was very surprised because most of the Nobel Prizes in literature have been given to male Caucasians and Europeans. So Louise Glück is, yes, she's Caucasian, but she's a woman. She's not from Europe, and she's a poet. And so she said that she was surprised that she was selected as this year's laureate. None of her work has been translated into Korean as of now. However, I was able to read her work in English, and it is quite different from the very trivial emotions. It actually shows the expansibility and the transparency of lyric sentiments. And this marginal genre of lyric poetry can actually provide healing properties and consolation and empathy. So the Swedish Academy saw that this was something that had to be recognized in these times. So poetry is a literary genre of minorities. In particular, lyric poetry is so. But now lyric poetry is at the center of attention of the world. Korean literature should also bring together a universal poetic sensibilities, and also something that is very uniquely Korean. So Kim Il-dum, Kim Hae-sun are some examples that are writing in their language as Korean women writers, and they are well appreciated from readers and critics from around the world. And in fiction, we have Han Gang, who won the Man Booker International Award for her book, The Vegetarian, which dealt with the very universal theme of violence and also state violence, which touched the strings of literature readers around the world. And Pyeon Hae-young is also well received around the world. So the significance and implications of this very long-standing award from the Nobel Committee had been, up to now, focused on the Western world and men, but now it seems to be expanding its horizons to include and recognize women, lyric poetry, and non-European authors. So the marginalized and excluded beings are now being brought into recognition. So discovering women poets and supporting such women poets is something that we have to do to promote our young poets today.
제가
Lastly, I would like to share with you a poem from Louis Glick titled The Fear of Burial. It could translate to the fear of being buried in Korean. And this poem is about the loneliness, the isolation of the deceased. There is nothing left for that lonely soul. And the distance between ourselves and the deceased has become very long. While we go on in our daily lives, the deceased will take or embark on a journey, a long journey. So it deals with the ambivalence of life and death. So it isn't really metaphysical, and neither does it bring on feelings of despair or darkness when those are the feelings that you usually think of when you're thinking of death. It's actually quite a beautiful piece of poetry. So the Nobel Prize in Literature had been focused on more topical themes. However, this year's prize shows that it is turning back to what we feel in our daily lives. Of course, the decision might be determined by many political tendencies. However, I do hope that lyric poetry will continue to be recognized and appreciated. So at today's literature session of the Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program, I hope that this program serves as an opportunity to have Korean lyric poetry to be translated very aptly into foreign languages and shared overseas, so we can someday win the Nobel Prize for Korea as well. And with that, I would like to close my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. Please have a seat on stage and stay up here. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Let's get back to that in a little minute. We have some questions for you. First, I would like to invite a guest that will join us for the panel discussion, Ms. Haun Shim. Ms. Shim is the editor-in-chief at ENG Namu Publishing. She holds a master's in French literature and has produced and edited 150 literary works from around the world. You are very warmly welcome, Ms. Haun Shim. Please. And good to see you back, Professor Öhman, as well. I have, just to kick off with, for you, Ms. Shim, I have a question for you. Can you tell us what the reaction was in the publishing industry upon the news of Louise Glück being awarded the Nobel Prize?
Well, it was quite a surprise. Korea time, 8 o'clock, we get the news, and we got the news real time. And so we were watching the news and they announced American poet Louise Glück, and everyone was surprised, and we didn't even get the name at first. And I think other publishers were quite shocked. And at the same time, there was relief, and then everyone went back home because there was no publisher that had published Louise Glück's work, and nobody was ready. And so we didn't have to work at night. And the journalists who were covering this story, I think they were busy because they had written their articles earlier, and that was of no use. And so the next morning, they called us and asked, is anything ready? And I said to the journalist, I'm writing up a list as you speak, and then you will be able to get a beautiful poetry book in sometime soon.
Professor Öhman, what was your reaction when you heard the name?
Yes, I had actually heard Louise Glück's name, but I hadn't read her myself. So this has been a very fortunate, I think, for me as a poetry reader to explore and find a new poetic voice, such as Louise Glück's.
So, Professor Jo, she wasn't very well known in Korea. Had you heard about her before?
Before she was announced as the laureate for this year, no, I really hadn't heard of her. And as Ms. Eman, Professor Eman said earlier, we usually look up a lot of material once the laureate is announced, but it was difficult for me to access information on Louise Glück in the first stages.
Professor Öhman, you mentioned in your presentation that your appreciation of the exchange of reading experience, that this opportunity is, and I'm also sensing I'm having an experience of exchange reading experience from listening to you and to Professor Yu of how what the things are that you are lifting out in the poetry of Louise Glück that you appreciate. And it strikes me as being quite similar. Before, I was very curious about how well poetry translates, not only between languages, but also between cultures. And the United States and South Korea are worlds apart in some context. And when in the prize motivation by the Swedish Academy, they are talking about the universality in her poetic voice, and there seems that maybe there is really such a universality that is translating, making both of you, all of you perhaps, appreciating the same qualities in her poetry. Professor Jo, could you What are your thoughts on how poetry translates in this respect?
So Robert Frost, the famous American poet, defined poetic language as follows. The language that cannot be translated, the language that is non-translatable. That was how Robert Frost defined poetic language. And Stéphane Mallarmé, the symbolism poet of 19th century France, said also that compared to prose, prose is about semantic translation, but translation of poetry is not only about meaning, but also a sentiment and colors or flavors of language that are unique to a certain people or ethnicity. But there are still universal qualities to poetry. When I, for example, hear a reading of Russian poetry, I can feel the musicality, and I somehow get part of the message. But Louis Glick's poetic language seems to be something more accessible. It's not really local, or it's not really very difficult. So it might come across as something approachable to Korean readers. However, still, poetry translation is fundamentally difficult. A poem will have to be very fortunate to come across a good translator. And I hope that poetry, not only from other countries but also Korea, will be translated very well. And KLTI has quite a role to play.
Professor Erman.
Well, yes, I would agree with both Professor Hu and of course Robert Frost and Stéphane Mallarmé on this. Of course, it is impossible in every meaning to translate poetry, but still we have to try, just as we have to translate languages when we are speaking in an event like this with each other. But I think it's very important to include that poetry distinctly separate from prose, that it is, and I quite agree on that there is also a whole world of not only words but also sensual world which come from childhood and the surroundings. What are the atmosphere? What are the smells? What are the feelings in the atmosphere surrounding Louise Glick in her childhood on Long Island in New York, for instance, that are quite different from, I guess, the central world in Seoul, Korea, or in perhaps also in Sweden. And there are distinct memories we grow up, but there are also profound differences. But it's the effort to try, to share, to translate and make words and experiences travel across language barriers and of course other limits and borders between countries and people. That is the most beautiful aspect and dimension, I think, of the Nobel Prize, that this suddenly becomes the poet that everybody, or at least many of us poetry readers, want to read in our own language as well. In Swedish, I think there were, when the Nobel Prize was announced, I think there were 2 or 3 collections of poetry translated by Louise Glick, but not much more than that. But I think that this effort is the thing that we have to focus on, the willingness to share, even though we know that it is untranslatable. We still try.
Ms. Shim, when you're producing translations, I guess you are assuming from another position than poetry being untranslatable when you make the the commercial assessment of whether a book will be possible to sell when you translate it. How are you choosing your titles to translate on their quality of translatability, if you catch my meaning?
So to be truthful, the translatability is an issue that has been an issue of contention for quite a while. But for publishing houses like 은행나무, we just assume that this is translatable. And we assume that it should be readable in beautiful Korean language. Because I'm an editor, when I get the translated manuscript, of course the translators do their best to make it as perfect as possible, but it might not feel that way when readers read the manuscript. So as an editor, I try to bridge those two different perspectives. So if the poetic language, if the vocabulary is too difficult, too highbrow, then we make a recommendation to make it a little more accessible to the readers. So we have these very lengthy debates with the translators. Which word would be more appropriate? Those were the things that we would discuss. We really actually spend quite a lot of time on those topics.
I would love that. That would be fantastic. Debating a word for days or maybe weeks even. That would be very interesting. I'm guessing that the 2016 award to Bob Dylan sort of opened the floodgates for the perception of what kind of poetry can be awarded in the Nobel Prize by the Swedish Academy. Do you see that there can be other types of poetry or literary expressions also being awarded after that award and Louise Glück's award? Professor Öhman?
Well, yes. Many people talk about Bob Dylan as a kind of a groundbreaking new recipient of the Nobel Prize, but I think that it wasn't new in that way, in the poetic expression as much as in the shared experience. And if I go back, I want to go back again to the Nobel Prize motivation for this year's laureate, Louise Glück, and the presupposition of a universal experience, because new forms for me in this specific Nobel Prize context is not so much a matter of genre as of which human experiences can be regarded as universal, as I touch upon in my talk as well. Just to mention two examples from previous Nobel laureates, I would say, for instance, 1945, when Gabriela Mistral received the Nobel Prize in Literature with her background in groundbreaking ideas about teaching for children as well as for women. And she wrote poetry with roots in nursery rhymes and liberation theology, and she was up to this date the only woman from South America that has been awarded with a Nobel Prize. Likewise, I would say that Toni Morrison, who received the prize in 1993, who wrote these heart-ripping and very poetic novels about, as she called it herself, the unspeakable and unwritable experiences of black slaves and their ancestors in the United States of America, contesting the normalization and dominance of white Western culture in modern literature and its understanding of human values. Other example might be Mo Yan, the Chinese novelist, and of course, as Professor Hu already mentioned, the Belarusian essayist Svetlana Alexievich, who both in different ways and in different style widens the perspective on what literature can do more than perhaps what literature is. So, of course, I was not neither surprised nor shocked about Bob Dylan as a Nobel Prize laureate. I think it was quite he was a good prize winner. But I think that we have to broaden the perspective of what is new. It's not only the mere genre and poetic expression as such, but the experiences that they transform and share with the readers.
Professor Yu, do you share that view of Dylan and the role the award has for the Nobel Prize?
So, as far as I remember, when Bob Dylan's winning of the award was announced, the response was very divided into two different viewpoints. One was that the genre was being expanded. So the horizon of literature was moving beyond the traditional forms of fiction or poetry, and it was looking for universal empathy, and lyrics could conjure shared ideas and shared sentiments. So some people welcomed that. But some people, at the same time, who very much revered the very highbrow quality of the Nobel Literature Prize, said that this wasn't a right decision. And I think I was quite ambivalent on that point as well. So when a prize is awarded, it might be a passing judgment, but it also is an institutional force that sets the direction for what is going to be mainstream. I don't think that other Bob Dylans will win the prize in the near future, but I believe that Bob Dylan winning this prize is going to expand the horizons of the prize to other genres as well. And President Kim Hae-suk of Ewha Women's University earlier mentioned the writer Jo Nam-ju, and her most famous work of fiction is Kim Ji-young, born in 1982. So it's a little bit shorter than what we think of when we're thinking about a full-length novel. And in terms of its construction, it's also a little bit different. So some people came up with the term that it's a light, full-length novel. However, the multiple volume Korean works such as Land or the Taebaek Mountain or the very serious and heavy works from Russian writers such as Dostoevsky, who is going to write that sort of work in the future? And then we also ask and see that something that would not be considered as full-length fiction has won awards and is selling very well in the market. And aside from the traditional forms, we have the online fiction, web fiction, and I wonder if Nobel Prize will be able to continue to shy away or ignore those new forms. So about Bob Dylan winning the prize, you might like it or you might hate it, but years down the road, it will probably serve as a milestone in which modern literature had been expanded. And Svetlana Alexievich is also very important as a winner, because a nonfiction piece, a nonfiction writer winning the award was quite shocking to myself. So perhaps we could look for such possibilities in Korea as well. I am a literary critic, and I believe that literary critics might also be eligible for the prize. So up to now, creative writing has been the focus. However, literary criticism might also be brought into a body of candidates for the Nobel Prize. And perhaps maybe Korean literary criticism might be translated and shared across other markets as well.
Speaking of these different types of genres, I'm not envious of the Swedish Academy having probably hundreds of nominations to consider when they are picking a winner. Do you have any guess as to how they are working to approach picking out the winners, or at least the top contenders? How do we compare quality in literature when which is what they really need to do? Is there some basic footing? It's not an exact science, of course. Eventually it becomes politics, perhaps. But how do you approach it, and how do you make these choices? Professor Jo, if you would start.
노벨상.
So, what we say among literary critics, so the political trends and the times that are reflected in the Nobel Prize, best by the Nobel Peace Prize, because it's not quantifiable, and then comes literature. So chemistry, physiomedicine, or economics, compared to those, literature is not going to be quantified in its quality. So it's about an accumulation of feelings towards works. So the discourses or agenda items or situations that the world is facing at that time, if they correspond to the works that are nominated, the authors that are nominated, and if there's a synergistic effect, they would also look for the response from the public before they make the choice. And when I am faced by the news of a winner, rarely do we say that I knew that person would win. You have to have some time before you really agree or accept the outcomes. I don't believe that every time the committee made the right choice, but years down the road, we will see the significance of that choice. And oftentimes, even though the evaluation is not based on science, it would be based on the common sense and sensibilities of the Academy members.
Professor Ehrman?
Yeah, I think it's notoriously difficult to talk about quality in literature, as there cannot, in my opinion at least, never be such a thing as an objective value or quality in literature. So many other factors such as time, historic situation, gender, language, and other, for us, of course, the secret considerations of the Academy will also play a role here. But with this reservation, of course, you can talk about the individual qualities of a specific writer or poet, but you cannot not ever, as I guess you can say in medicine or chemistry, that this is the very poet or novelist that has pushed forward the limits of what is possible to do in the genre of literature, in the broadest sense of the word. So what is so difficult in relation to literature is the comparison, that you can never say that actually this was the right writer who won this year's prize. It's impossible. It's almost impossible to say that. So I think that likewise, if you see the Nobel Prize in Literature as a competition, please let us leave that to the betting companies. But the other part of the question, of course, I think there is a very, very good observation from Professor Jo that the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature as well as the Peace Prize perhaps says something more about the state of mind, the mindset of people in a broader sense in this actual time in history and situation in history. And also, of course, I think there are some shared experiences in the 21st century in a global context that we can share, but we can never say that it was the right winner this year and it was the wrong winner last year. There can be many arguments raised, as for instance last year, in relation to one of the two prize winners in literature, Peter Handke, and his perhaps a bit dubious political investments in the Balkan Wars that many critics raised as a problematic circumstance in awarding Peter Handke the Nobel Prize. But that is no objective argument, I think, for saying that the quality of his literary achievements are less when you set them in relation to a more political contemporary context. So it's notoriously difficult, but of course we can and we must talk about quality, but we also must relativize it a bit.
Thank you. We're going to have a look at what questions we have from the audience, but first I would like to ask Ms. Shim. So Louise Glück will now be translated to Korean. Do you think she will find an audience here in Korea, and do you also think that it may raise interest in poetry more than yesterday, so to speak?
네, 저는 그렇게
I believe so. There's a lot of readers who are reading poetry anthology, and Mary Oliver's poetry book was well received in Korea. Korean readers love to read poetry. When poetry books are published, we have reading sessions, and sentiments are expressed with trembling voices. I think the same will go for Louise Glück. I think it will be loved by the Korean readers, and I want to publish her book.
That's a good grading she's getting. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Oh, there are several. How do we choose from these? Let's take the first one. Does the Nobel Prize in Literature appear as a major issue of literary society that influences readers to think of the fundamental of literature? Is any one of you compelled to answer this? Professor Öhman?
Well, yes, it's a bit difficult to see if this is indeed a major event in the literary society as a whole, at least if you put it in a global context. But of course, nowadays, what is a media event is a major event, and the Nobel Prize is the most famous literary prize still today. So I guess so, but also you must note that most Nobel laureates in literature, they have already made their major achievements when they receive the prize. So I don't think that they will, at least not in any direct way, affect literary society and influence new writers in an obvious way, as they have many times, as with Louise Glück. She's been a writer for more than 50, almost 60 years, and some of her achievements are that also. So I think that you must have that in the picture as well. It is a major event, but not in the way perhaps how it affects the literary society as a whole.
Professor Jo?
Well, what I expect is, unlike other countries, if Korea wins a Nobel Literature Award, then it will have a much more larger impact than what is seen in the Western world, and it will send reverberations across the entire publishing market. For example, when Han Gang won the Man Booker International Prize, her book, The Vegetarian, which wasn't really popular before, became a bestseller, and all of her previous works had also become steady sellers. And so many people were much more interested in the writer Han Gang. And she wrote about domestic violence, but she also dealt with issues in contemporary Korean history, the experience of violence in contemporary Korean history, and that became everyday language of the vocabulary of even young students as well. So Koreans have a high regard for literature, and I believe that it's not just going to be people saying that someone has won the award, but it's going to have such an impact on the Korean literary tradition. It will become the universal standard, and I do hope that if we win that award, it will be from a very good writer.
Things will be changing fundamentally when it comes to poetry after Dylan. I mean, we can now listen to Louise Glück on Spotify, inexpensive headphones, and have her favorite poems on repeat if we like that. And Professor Yor, what you mentioned of appreciating listening to Russian poetry even if you don't understand it, I do that every day when I'm listening to K-pop that my daughter is playing. So the translation doesn't always have to be there. I would like to continue this conversation, but unfortunately we are up with time. And we need to save a couple of minutes for Ambassador Hallgren as well. But thank you so much for taking your time and participating here. Anneli Brännström Öhman, Song-Ho Yo, and Heun Shim. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We can walk off this way. And then I invite the Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea, Jakob Hallgren, to give a few closing words. Thank you.
Well, I think that was a fantastic ending symposia of this year's first and inaugural Sweden-Korea Nobel Memorial Program. And I would like to thank Dr. Hector, Professor Brännström Öhman, and Professor Sung-Ho Yo, and Editor-in-Chief Heun Shim for these wonderful reflections on poetry and literature. And I must say I was so inspired myself, and I hope you share that feeling about the force of poetry. Expressions like existential gardening, what a wonderful expression. And I must say, I myself sympathize very much with the ghost of a boy in a middle-aged man's body, if I just extrapolate on what was just said. Is poetry universal or is it not? Is it possible to translate those inner feelings in a language that poetry projects or not? And how accessible or approachable is it or is it not? And then when the discussion moved over to how you define literature, how you define poetry, and how wonderfully broad it can become, I was really so inspired, and maybe also this comment about that this, if maybe one of together with the Peace Prize, is probably the best sign of our times of sorts. So all of these were reflections that I had, and I hope and I'm sure that you had similar or shared similar or other strong emotions after having heard this extremely rich and interesting discussion. And I must also say that since this is the last of 3 symposia today on the sciences, on economics, and now on literature, what a success! What a rich exchange, what a rich, I mean, wow, what fantastic scholars we have in our 2 countries, and we have so much to talk about, so much to share, and so much to build on. And this is why I am so happy that when I said at the outset today that this was the inaugural event, I mean it, because this is intended to be an annual event. We were supposed to have a whole week of celebration of curiosity, research, science, literature, but for obvious reasons we had to go online. This was extremely successful, but it gives me so much inspiration and appetite to redo this next year, hopefully over a week with a lot of other activities attached to this, where people can come from Sweden and meet and exchange in the valuable presence of being together and talking directly in the same room. So thank you so much, everybody. Thanks to all of our partners, to President of LTI Korea, President of Eva Women's University, to the supporting university in Sweden, and not least all of our corporate sponsors who have made this possible. Thank you so very much. Kamsahamnida. See you next year.